Once again, we're back with yet another installment of this series where we go draft to draft and give a grade to every pick made in the lottery based on how successful or unsuccessful it worked out for that team based on the context and data we have available to us 9 years later. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the 2011 draft class, which is definitely one of the strongest classes of the decade, with quite a few big-time stars being taken early on. However, with that being said, not every team hit a home run the way they wanted, with quite a few of the players we'll discuss in the video being amongst the biggest busts of the entire decade. Before we start though, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, as all support is very much appreciated. Now with that being said, let's begin. Starting with the first pick in the class, the Cleveland Cavaliers selected Kyrie Irving and brought in the man that would eventually go on to play a massive role in bringing the franchise their first ever NBA title. Irving's lone season at Duke was riddled with injuries, but that didn't stop teams from seeing the elite potential he had, so despite that, he still went first overall. Back at full health in time for the season, he went on to win Rookie of the Year and display the magic he's able to create with his ball handling ability, shot creation, and elite scoring. When LeBron came back to Cleveland in 2014, the two of them formed one of the most dynamic and explosive duos in the entire league, and together, they made 3 straight NBA Finals, winning it all in 2016 with Irving putting up massive numbers and actually hitting the series-winning shot in Game 7. His tenure in Cleveland may have ended on a sour note when he requested to leave to try to be the man on his own team, but that doesn't take away all the amazing memories he created with them, so because of that, the pick without question gets an A+ grade. Next up with the second pick in the draft, the Minnesota Timberwolves selected Derrick Williams. In theory, Williams had all of the makings of an exciting NBA star. However, as we've seen countless times in this series, the idea of a prospect can occasionally be greater than the actual product. As a power forward, Williams was strong, had incredibly long arms, explosive athleticism, good touch around the rim, and promising shooting ability. There's a reason he went number 2 overall, because he looked like the whole package. However, once he began playing for the Wolves, it became apparent a lot of those strengths were heavily overstated, and the production from college didn't quite translate. His perimeter shooting was always below league average, his strength and face-up game weren't as impactful at the NBA level, and his career fizzled out sooner than expected. He did have decent production for a few years, but nothing special and definitely not up to par for a number 2 pick, so while he wasn't a complete bust, he is someone who failed to live up to the expectations. And for that, the pick gets a grade of a D. Next up with the third pick in the draft, the Utah Jazz selected Enes Kanter. Kanter was the mystery prospect of the class because while he was supposed to play for Kentucky that season, he was ruled ineligible by the NCAA and never suited up. Even without watching him play, scouts liked his size for a big man, his strength, his dominant post-up game, and his rebounding ability, so he was still one of the first names taken off the board. Now, while all of those things that I just mentioned have continued to be parts of his game that he excels at, the weaknesses in his game, specifically on defense, have held him back. He's slow on his feet and can get torched in pick-and-roll situations, and every year, he's a negative on that end of the floor. He's at best as a bench player who can rebound well and provide a scoring option down low for the second unit, but no team with him in the starting lineup getting big minutes wins anything major. He's proven to be a decent player with big flaws, so for a grade, especially having taken him so early on in a talented draft, this one only gets a grade of a C. Next up with the fourth pick in the draft, the Cleveland Cavaliers selected Tristan Thompson. Unlike Kanter, Thompson was a very different kind of big man prospect, who actually did most of his damage on the defensive side of things and being decent at best on offense. He rolls well and finishes his chances around the basket at a high level, but realistically, he's the kind of big man who relies on those around him to set up his opportunities. He's become one of the best rebounders in the entire league, especially on the offensive glass, and his non-stop motor also played a big role in the Cavaliers winning a ring in 2016 alongside Kyrie Irving. He may not have become a star, but he played his role tremendously on teams that made a lot of noise, so for that, this one actually gets a pretty good grade of a B. Next up with the fifth pick in the draft, the Toronto Raptors selected Jonas Valanciunas. Valanciunas was a big, strong anchor for the Raptors for 6 seasons, and in that time, he developed his game tremendously. He may not have been all-star caliber, but he did his job well and put up some pretty good numbers along the way. He's a very good scorer around the basket, knows where to be and when to get to his spots, and defensively he holds his own. He's been one of the better starting centers in the league for a while now, and that just speaks to how hard he works to improve his game. Unfortunately, the Raptors traded him the year that they would go on to win it all, but the team acquired Marc Gasol in return, who played a massive role on that championship run. He may not have contributed to winning the ring, but he was still a big part of the team for several years, and for that, the pick gets a grade of a B+. Up next with the 6th pick in the draft, the Washington Wizards select Jan Vesely. Vesely was seen as the best international prospect in the class by most because of his incredible height and length, combined with his ability to move very well while possessing a good motor to make him an incredibly intriguing big man prospect. He was incredibly thin though, and while the hope was that he would add strength to his game over time as he matured, that just never happened. He struggled to carve out a consistent role in any of his 3 seasons in Washington, barely producing at all in the minutes he got, and in his 3rd season, he was traded to Denver, which pretty much sealed his fate as a bust. He never played a 4th season in the NBA, flaming out quicker than most other busts we've discussed throughout this series, so unfortunately, I have no other choice but to grade this one an F. Next up with the 7th pick in the draft, the Sacramento Kings selected Bismack Biyombo, but immediately traded him to the Charlotte Bobcats on draft night. Biyombo's had a pretty peculiar NBA career to this point, as he's carved a role for himself on the defensive end of the floor, while not really providing much at all on the offensive end. He's proved to be a very good shot blocker and rim protector in the paint from very early on, while doing a good job rebounding the ball, but he only scores about 5 points per game. He only played 4 years with the Hornets before they let him walk in free agency, so his time with the team that acquired him on draft night wasn't necessarily the greatest or most impactful, but he was decent, so for a grade, this one also gets a C. Next up, with the 8th pick in the draft, the Detroit Pistons selected Brandon Knight. Sure, Knight is most known for being the guy who always seems to find himself on the wrong end of poster dunks, but even though injuries have hampered his career over the last few seasons, early on he was a pretty solid player. In his first 2 seasons in Detroit, he established himself as a very solid combo guard, providing shot creation for both himself and others while shooting the ball well from the perimeter. However, those would be the only 2 seasons he would play in Detroit, getting traded to Milwaukee that summer in a package that sent Brandon Jennings to Detroit in return. So even though his stint with the team that drafted him was short, it was still solid overall, so for that, the grade gets a B-. Up next with the 9th pick in the draft, the Charlotte Bobcats selected Kemba Walker. Kemba was an electrifying college player that led his UConn Huskies to a national championship victory by putting his dazzling scoring ability on display for the world. Even with this being the case, though, NBA scouts had concerns about him being undersized for an NBA guard and lacking the elite athleticism they always crave. Yet, as is the case in countless examples, sometimes simply knowing how to play the game at a high level, no matter how big you are or how high you can jump, can lead to success, and Kemba proved this to be the case. He was the face of the franchise for 8 years, making 3 All-Star teams and leading them to the playoffs a couple times as well. His tenure came to an end last summer when he left in free agency for Boston, but after all that time the franchise failed to put any substantial talent around him, so you can't really blame him. The pick gets an A+ though, being one of the few times this front office actually nailed a draft pick. Up next with the 10th pick in the draft, the Sacramento Kings selected Jimmer Fredette. Now, this one's going to hurt me to talk about personally, because I remember being all in on the Jimmer hype. At BYU, in college, he was one of the most fun to watch players I had ever seen, confidently shooting from literally anywhere he wanted on the court, and doing so efficiently and effectively while leading the country in scoring. His shooting ability was like nothing we had ever seen before, because Steph Curry hadn't yet taken the next step towards stardom at this point, so a ton of people thought he could change the game like Steph would go on to do. However, his NBA career didn't exactly get off to the fastest start. He was still a pretty good shooter, but he wasn't able to get his shot off as confidently and freely as he did in college, and the physicality and talent of NBA defenders proved to be far tougher on him than anticipated. He only lasted 2.5 seasons in Sacramento before getting traded, and from there, he would struggle to find consistent minutes. He's been making a name for for himself in China, but his NBA career was a pretty big bust, so this one unfortunately also gets an F grade. Next up, with the 11th pick in the draft, the Golden State Warriors selected Klay Thompson. Now, if the contrast between the last two picks don't tell you everything you need to know about the difference between the Warriors and Kings as franchises, I don't know what does. Klay wasn't by any means a flashy pick at the time, but as we all know, he would go on to become one of the greatest shooters the game has ever seen, and play a massive role on the dynasty that was the Warriors. When he catches fire, there's not a soul that can slow him down, and he's had several record-breaking performances to back that up. Steph Curry may be the primary ball handler and notorious greatest shooter of all time, but Klay is honestly not far off as a shooter, at all. Plus, he's always the one defending the opposition's best perimeter player. For the Warriors to find him near the end of the lottery is like striking gold, so without a doubt, this pick also gets an A+. Up next, with the 12th pick in the draft, the Utah Jazz selected Alec Burks. Burks has had a decent career in the league so far, and his time in Utah wasn't bad by any means, but you can clearly see that his best years production-wise came when the team wasn't exactly winning much, and right when they started to become playoff contenders, his role got reduced. He's a decent scoring option off the bench that can create his own shot and operate as a secondary ball handler, but ultimately, he's just average at best, and his defensive game isn't quite up to par. He's yet another example of a pick being not necessarily good, but also not really bad either, so as far as a grade, it's right in the middle with a C. Next up, with the 13th pick in the draft, the Phoenix Suns selected Markieff Morris. Markieff and his brother Marcus played together at Kansas and declared for the draft at the same time, so as you'll see with the next pick, their incredibly similar play styles made things tough to determine which of them would be the better of the two brothers. Early on, it did look like the Suns got the better of the two, because for a few seasons, Morris was a solid 15-point-per-game scorer who excelled with his face-up game, had a silky smooth mid-range jumper, and he brought a level of toughness on both ends of the floor. He had some very solid seasons for Phoenix, so because of that, this pick gets a grade of a B. And finally, the last pick in the lottery was made by the Houston Rockets, and with it, they chose Marcus Morris, brother of Markieff. Now, as I mentioned before, right off the bat, Marcus wasn't quite as productive as Markieff, and it took him a while to carve out a big role for himself in the league. He only spent a year and a half in Houston, barely playing at all as a rookie, then playing decent minutes for half a season in year 2, before getting traded to Phoenix for a second-round pick to actually team up with his brother. Marcus would go on to prove to be the better of the two brothers and develop into one of the best stretch fours in the league shooting-wise, but unfortunately the grade is dependent on how well it worked out for the team that chose him, so because he didn't exactly make much noise in Houston and his time there ended with him only getting traded for a measly second-round pick, the grade for this one is a D. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below how you would grade these picks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.